I've made a few modifications to our OSPF configuration. Right now, R4 is using the new OSPF v3 configuration mode. Let's take a look at that. Show, run, pipe to section, OSPF v3, OSPF v3. Let's take a look at our configuration that we have. All right. So these are some of the commands that are configured under interface configuration mode. We'll come back and take a look at those after. But here we can see that we have our two different address families identified. We have our IPv6 address family and our IPv4 address family. You can see the different router IDs that we set up. We also have the default information originate command underneath the IPv6 address family. We just did this to add a few additional information. So you can see the difference in the hierarchical structure here. If you go to a specific interface, for example, interface serial or gigabit Ethernet 2/0, show run interface gigabit Ethernet 2/0. When we look at this output, we can see our OSPF v3 commands that are placing the interface in the particular address family and the appropriate area, as we can see here. So OSPF v3.1 IPv4 address family, throw this interface in area 0, and for the IPv6 address family, throw this interface into area 0 as well. Show OSPF v3. That's the show command. Show OSPF v3. And what do we want to look at? Whatever it gives us right now. So we can see here that it's separating out the address families for us. Here's our OSPF v3 process ID address family for IPv4. Now the information we find in here is going to be the same information that we are accustomed to with the show IP OSPF command. We can verify our router ID, as we can see, as well as the SPF numbers and timers that we have for LSA intervals. All that's the same. We can still see our reference bandwidth. Our reference bandwidth is 100 megabits per second. That doesn't change just because we're using this new configuration mode. All it is a new configuration mode. And if we continue on down, we can see area 0 in this case has been configured on R4. And we have two interfaces in area 0. So all the information is the same. We now have the output of the IPv6 address family. And if we look at the IPv6 address family, there's the router ID that we had changed in the configuration. Let me scroll back up for you. If you remember, we said the router ID was going to be 44, 44, 44, 44, 44. Well, it is. Whereas for IPv4, it's 4444. So completely different router ID, but it could be the same router ID. That's perfectly fine. It doesn't have to be different router IDs. And then all the same information that we're accustomed to, and down below we can see the area information. We have 3 areas specifically on R4 in this case that are enabled for the IPv6 OSPF v3 address family. So let's look at the output of show OSPF v3 interface show OSPF v3, there we go, interface brief. Notice the big difference here. It actually has a column that says address family. So you can verify which address family the interface is part of. And notice some of the interfaces are repeated multiple times. We have gigabit 2/0 that's in IPv4 address family, and gigabit 2/0 that's also in the IPv6 address family, because that's the way we configured it. But all the other information is the same. We're already accustomed to the other columns in this output. If we look at the output of show IP OSPF v3 interface, so forget about the brief addition. Let's look at the output of just interface. You will see how the interfaces, for example, are going to be represented for both IPv4 address family and the IPv6 address family, both. So let's just grab a specific interface in this case, gigabit Ethernet 2/0, and let's see how many times it shows up. It's going to show up twice for us. We have it showing up here for the IPv4 address family configuration, and you can see the router ID that's listed here of 4444. That's the one we had for the IPv4 address family. And then down below, we can see our IPv6 address family configuration, and our router ID as we had configured it was 44, 44, 44, 44. So again, it's one command, yet you're getting the output for both interfaces, or pardon me, you're getting the output for the same interface twice, one for each address family in this particular case. Let's look at our neighbors. Show IP OSPFv3 neighbors. And when we look at the neighbor output here, we can see that we have our neighbors for the IPv4 address family, and we have our neighbors for the IPv6 address family. So it's just simply two different neighbor tables right there in the same output for us to look at. So if you want to verify your IPv4 neighbors, they're there on top. If you want to verify your IPv6 neighbors, they're there on the bottom. Now, here's an issue we run into. In my environment, you can see that I have this neighborship with an IPv4 router, which is R5. Let's look at the topology briefly. R4 is a neighbor with R5 in the address family IPv4. We also want R4 to be a neighbor with R3. So that means gigabit 2/0 has to be enabled for the OSPFv3 process. Well, let's take a look at that. And we can see that it is. It is. It's enabled. It's running IPv4 OSPF on the interface. Let's go over to R3. If I go over to R3 and I type in show IP OSPF interface brief, notice that gigabit 3/0 is participating in the routing process as well. What must match in order for two OSPF routers to form a neighbor adjacency? Timers must match, area IDs must match, authentication must match, stub flags must match, subnets must match, MTUs must match. Well, they all match in this case, folks. So why has R5 not formed a neighborship? Why has R3 not formed a neighborship with R4? It's because the OSPFv3 address family configurations are not backwards compatible with routers that are running OSPFv2 configurations. Show run piped section router OSPF. We can see here that R3 is running the traditional classic OSPFv2 configuration. Therefore, it's not compatible because it doesn't understand the new OSPFv3 structure and information. But notice, it is backwards compatible with what? The IPv6 router OSPF classic configuration. So if we type in show IPv6 OSPF neighbors, we'll see that we're neighbors via IPv6 with R4, just not with with R4 with our OSPFv2 classic configuration because it's not backwards compatible. So that's a big issue we have with the transition over to this new OSPFv3 configuration. If you're running old OSPFv2 configs in your environment, as well as IPv6 router OSPF configs, then this new configuration mode is not easily backwards compatible with your old IPv4 routers, and as a result, it's much more work for you in order to transition over. You're going to have to take all the routers and essentially bring them over to this new OSPFv3 configuration.